Okay. So the purpose of today's lecture is to sort of give you a primer on how to navigate the NIH system and the sorts of things that you need to think about and talk about if you're going to go after NIH money. And the reason that you want to go out of NIH money, you're doing biomedical stuff, is that it really is the biggest pot of funds, and it's also the most diverse pot of funds. So they fund everything from actual clinical trials, community research, behavioral interventions, all the way through to the basic mechanisms involved with how gastrulation works in embryonic development. And just the true scope of what they're studying is just so, so broad. But that also means it can be very intimidating to try to find your way around the system. So the purpose of this really is to help you learn how to navigate through the NIH system, to even figure out who the right people are to talk to when you have questions. Okay, so the very first thing is that if you are going to be applying for NIH funding, that you have to get hooked up with the ERA Commons website. So ERA Commons is the official point of contact between the external world and NIH. Now, many of you might have ERA Commons accounts. That Erin, do the MRD A Awardees, do they have to get an ERA Commons account?
I think most of them have them. If they don't, they should get one because we will ask for it for the RPPR.
Okay. So for the MRD A Awardees can you guys just let me know if you have ERA Commons set up or not, or ERA Commons account?
This is Andrew, and I've actually switched over to the computer so I can look at the slides better. So I'm going to sign off the phone. If that's okay with you all. Okay. Now, do you have an ERA Commons account, though? I do, actually, yes. Okay, cool. All right, so that if you don't have an ERA Commons account, you absolutely need to get one set up. It is required for pretty much all communications with the NIH, that it is an online portal for all grants related communications, that you need to have a Commons account if you are going to submit a grant. It is the site that you upload your grant to. It is the location where you obtain your grant reviews. It's where you see your funding status. It's also the site that reviewers use to both view and score grant applications. It's also the site where, if you are funded, you upload your progress reports. Now, in the old days, the first time somebody would get an ERA Commons ID is if they are going to be submitting a grant. That more and more people, though, may already have an ERA Commons ID once they're at the stage of being a new investigator, because even if you do not have a grant, you have to have an ERA Commons ID if you receive salary support through an NIH mechanism. And what this means is that, for instance, I have undergraduates who work under my research lab, that I have to get ERA Commons IDs for all of my undergrads, and they have to communicate with them, because NIH is really putting a lot of emphasis on tracking where trainees go. So that if you've ever worked on an NIH-funded project, you're going to get an ERA Commons ID, and that is the same ERA Commons ID you would have through your entire career. So if you had one as an undergraduate researcher for some reason, that ERA Commons ID is also the same one you would be using when you're a faculty member, because they want to look at, have you been touched by NIH funding in the past as a trainee, and how does that parse into being touched by NIH funding as a independent investigator? That I think some of you may end up having undergraduates working for you through the Embry Summer Scholars Program, that all of those Embry Summer Scholars also have ERA Commons IDs. Now, So you have to obtain an ID prior to submitting a grant, and that if you don't have one, you should definitely institute that at least a month out. Or if you've changed institutions, let's say you had an ERA Commons ID during your residency, and now you're a faculty member at your institutions, that you have to institute a affiliation change where, like, let's say you did your residency at Thomas Jefferson, and now you're a faculty member at Nemours. You have to have your institutional affiliation actually switched from Thomas Jefferson to Nemours in order to have your grant be submitted through the Nemours system. Now, the reason that you really should obtain these far in advance is that you cannot do any of these things yourself. You cannot initiate a change in institution, and you can't initiate the formation of a Commons ID. This has to be done by your institutional grants office. And that, because of that extra step, means that you have to work with them. Now, just as so for instance, let's say you are hiring somebody to work on your grant. I don't know if this is appropriate for the MRDA mechanism, but let's say you get a CTR pilot grant and you hire a resident or a graduate student or a fellow, and they are funded for some effort on your pilot grant. You have to get an ERA Commons ID for them, because when you do the reporting of your grant progress, you have to give the names of everybody who worked on the project, whether they're paid under the grant or not. And those names have to go with the ERA Commons ID. And just for a piece of advice, that you might have a short-term person working for you for 2 months. At the beginning of the grant, they get a job, they go off into Never Never Land. That it is really hard sometimes to get them signed up in ERA Commons if they've been in a new position for 10 months. So you should do that when you hire somebody on NIH funding. You should automatically just make sure that they have an ERA Commons ID and you know what it is. Now, NIH actually now has a very nice site that is new to ERA Commons that they've just initiated. There's an article in the NIH communication system, and there's a training link there that talks about how you deal with the ERA Commons. You will have to log in and populate a lot of biographical data once the ERA Commons ID is set up. Okay, so ERA Commons is something that you're going to have to do just to really even be involved with NIH at all. Now, to back up a second, that I want to kind of explain NIH and how it's structured. As I said, NIH has a really big breadth of what it does.
Melinda?
Yeah,
Duncan?
sure. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, this is Evan. Just really quick question before we move away from ERA for 1 second.
Absolutely.
On the NIH site, it lists a couple of options for how you submit your application, either using the ASSIST program or the institutional system-to-system thing. Can you just explain? Does everyone use ASSIST? I don't even really know what the other institutional system-to-system thing is. But
so for instance, so ASSIST is if you are just using NIH forms and directly interfacing with the NIH system yourself, uploading stuff. For instance, at the University of Delaware, we do not use ASSIST to communicate with NIH ever. And there are a number of off-the-shelf solutions that universities purchase subscriptions to, where they're basically administrative systems to help with application setup. The University of Delaware, for instance, uses a system called CAIUS, and CAIUS is basically this license that for grants administration, so that when I submit an NIH grant, I give all the pieces to my grants administrator, and she uploads each piece as it goes to CAIUS.
And Cayuse has mechanisms where they like pre-vet the application and make sure all the parts are there.
Got it.
They basically have these auto-populated forms, like they do the auto-population of the NIH cover page. And this was actually, I'm in the middle of putting together a CTR pilot, and this actually flummoxed my grants person a little bit because she never uses the NIH forms to submit applications because that's all done through Cayuse, and everything is auto-populated in Cayuse. So that was the first time she's ever had to do an actual NIH page.
Okay, got it. So it sounds like, I would imagine that that's a question that's answered locally, but I imagine that.
Right. So which institution do you work at?
I'm at MUSC.
Okay. So to be honest, I wouldn't be a bit surprised if MUSC has a local grants management software thing, and that it's not via Assist. Just because most large institutions are not using NIH Assist. They're using these other mechanisms, but you have to talk to your local grants officer about that.
Okay, perfect. That makes a lot of sense. Thanks. Sorry for interrupting.
Okay. Oh, no, don't be sorry. That's actually, I need people to interrupt because, like I said, I can't see if you're looking hopeful that I will have a gap. So any other questions before I go on? Okay. So one of the things that a lot of people who are new to the NIH system have trouble getting their mind around is how to communicate with NIH and how to figure out what's going on. And a lot of this is because it is the National Institutes of Health, and that it's really a network of autonomous granting agencies that do share some common infrastructure. Now, currently there's 27 institutes and centers, as well as the Office of the Director. And the vast majority of these actually are independent grant writing or grant making agencies. And they each have their own missions and their own way of doing things. Each of these has a direct budget line item in the NIH appropriations bill that's passed by Congress that funds NIH. And each of these institutes and centers has its own mission. And they also have set up their own priorities. Now, each of these institutes has an intramural arm and an extramural arm. And the intramural arm is basically the research that's funded on site. The people who are running those research organizations are direct employees of the NIH, and they do their own thing with their own priorities. The extramural division, that's the division you're going to be interacting mostly, and that is the funding that leaves NIH and goes externally. One thing that is the intramural program and the extramural program each have their own director. Those directors then report to the director of the institute. It's not at all unusual for the intramural and the extramural program to have very different policies, very different priorities in grantsmanship, and they might not even fully overlap in scope. There have been some even stated priorities that there's certain research that is best done in the intramural program, and there's also, it's acknowledged that there's certain research that's best done in the extramural program. And for this reason, that it's not even unusual for the scope of funding in the two programs to be completely independent of each other. And that's something that you kind of have to understand when you're thinking about how institutes are funding things. Now, centers and offices are kind of more complicated. The number of NIH institutes is actually set in stone by Congress. And I actually forget what the number is off the top of my head, but that number cannot go up and down without congressional action. Centers and offices are a little bit more, even though a lot of them do have direct NIH appropriations, that their numbers go up and down on a more regular basis, that they have more diverse missions. Some have limited granting power, others don't. The Office of the Director mostly isn't a granting agency, but they do have some funds that are funded out of the Office of the Director. The most dramatic ones are these very early stage investigator grants, where they're basically trying to fund people who just got their PhD or MD to have them skip the postdoc or the fellowship to become independent investigators. The Fogarty Center is basically funds international collaborations. Under the current administration, the Fogarty Center's budget has been greatly slashed. The reason that I think it still exists on paper, but it really isn't able to do very much right now because of the lack of emphasis on international collaborations right now in the people running the government. There's also the National Center for Complementary Integrated Health. There's an awful lot of these centers and offices. You might be able to get funding through them or not. Okay, so, everybody on this call has very diverse research interests, and definitely people who are appropriately funded by the NIH have very, very diverse interests. And however, the first thing you have to identify is what institute would be interested in funding your work. And it can sometimes be really, really obvious. Like my work is all funded through the National Eye Institute. Well, I study blinding eye diseases. That's pretty obvious. The National Cancer Institute, they're interested in cancer. If you're studying diabetes, NIDDK is where you want to go. However, there are many places where it might not be clear. For instance, if I am studying early gastrulation in a sea urchin and I'm interested, does that get funded? Who funds that? And NIH absolutely does fund that kind of research. That under certain circumstances, it could go to child health and human development because it's a developmental biology project. It might go to the National Institute of Skeletal Disorders because actually sea urchin skeleton formation does model certain human skeletal diseases. Maybe it'll be funded by National Institute of General Medical Sciences. So one of the things that you do have to identify pretty early in what you're studying is who's going to fund it. And that, for instance, if you're studying some kind of outcomes-based medicine or some kind of community medicine, maybe you're interested in something related to sickle cell anemia, but you're interested in kidney complications. Well, is that NIDDK or does that get funded through heart, lung, and blood? And really the only way you can figure this out is by doing some research and talking to people. Now, there are cases where there is co-funding. So, for instance, research on diabetic retinopathy. So that's a diabetic disease of the eye, that there are grants that are co-funded by NIDDK and the National Eye Institute to cover that. Retinoblastoma, co-funding between National Eye Institute and National Cancer Institute. But it also sometimes can be how you write your grant is how you set up who's interested in it. So you do need to figure out who you're talking to. And then there's also, National Institute of General Medical Sciences and Environmental Health Sciences that these can fit stuff that doesn't clearly fit in a disease. So your first mission really is figuring out who the institute is going to be interested in funding your research is. You can submit grants without knowing that, but it's absolutely not recommended for a number of reasons that I hope become clear later on in this talk.
Melinda?
So, yeah.
We had one question come through chat. It's, are there grants for postdocs, and where and how do they find them?
Okay, so the grant for a postdoc would be the F-32 mechanism. That the F-32 mechanism is only for U.S. citizens and green card holders. That it is not for foreign nationals. but that is the biggest funding that is for postdocs. And I'll get to that in a little bit of talking about grant mechanisms and how you find information about them. But that it could either be on something called a T32, but that's a training grant that you do not apply for. That's applied for from your institution, and you're appointed to a training grant. If you want an individual postdoctoral award, that's the F32. Okay. Even if you, so let's say you are a postdoc and you want to apply for an F32 grant, you still have to figure out what institute would be funding that F32 mechanism. Now, if you are in a mentored situation, you definitely want to start talking to your more experienced colleagues. And it's always good to talk to people who are experienced, but it's also good to take that as a one data point and also to do research on your own, because sometimes just because somebody's experienced doesn't necessarily mean that they really understand the institutional priorities of all of the various bureaucracy at the NIH. I think probably the most robust way to start this research is to identify grants that NIH has given in the area of research that you're interested in pursuing in the recent past. And this is where you go to the NIH Reporter website. And this is the link to NIH Reporter. You can also just Google NIH Reporter and it comes up as a first Google hit. And this allows you to essentially search for any kind of information that you want related to research. So let's say you know that a certain person in your field is doing NIH-funded research. You can find a whole lot out about them by you put in the information about the principal investigator. You can search by all of the grants in an organization, all the grants in a particular department in an organization. Since I'm very involved in Delaware IDEA programs, I often will just search and put in the state. So I pull up all of the NIH funding held by everybody in the state of Delaware. You can also search for, let's say you worked in New York City and you wanted all the NIH grants held in New York City and the myriad of institutions there, you would just put New York, New York, and you'd pick up all the grants that have a New York mailing address. You can also do keyword and text searches. So you can search, for instance, in all the projects, which would search the project titles as well as the project summaries. And you can type here in a text search, and this will get, and if you just search for this year, you can get all the grants that are currently active in a particular area with a particular set of keywords. This is an extremely robust way to figure out what is NIH funding. That I did this search on a condition called posterior capsular opacification because that's what I'm currently funded to do. And I did this search last year, so it's only giving me fiscal year 16 results. And it turns out that the National Eye Institute or National Institutes of Health funds 5 projects studying posterior capsular opacification. And these are the 5 projects. And of these 5 projects, they're all start with an EY preface. So that means that they're all funded by the National Eye Institute because EY is the code for that. And it also, in the funding IC, that's basically the funding institute, NEI, is all the way through. And this is talking about the amount of money. Also, if I find a project that seems to fit, there's a little link here I could click, and it would pull up similar projects. So it would, if I find one project in the area that is appropriate or similar to my work, I can click on similar projects and it will use its own internal keywords to find others. Now, once you click, oh, back up a second. Sorry. So, here we go. Okay, so what I did in this case is that I clicked on a colleague of mine who works at Thomas Jefferson, So I clicked on Sue Menko's grant right here. And I can find out an awful lot about, no, I'm sorry, I clicked on another colleague of mine, Judy West-Mays, who she's actually in Canada, but NIH does fund international grants. And I clicked on her grant. And this is the primary information that pulls up. So it tells me the grant number, the title, who the principal investigator is, what institution the grant's to. It also gives me the abstract. Now, the abstract is what you submit with an NIH grant that's called the project summary. And those project summaries are public information if your grant is funded. And that's actually something that's kind of important to think about when you write into the project summary, because generally the project summaries aren't read by very many people in the review side of NIH, but they are what is the publicly available information about what you're funded on. And this is just laying out what she's doing on her project. And she's studying the role of matrix metalloproteases in this. It also gives you the public health relevance statement, which this actually is essentially written to Congress, that basically says, yes, this is why we're giving her, I think it was $300,000 a year to study this condition. This is laying out why we care about this. NIH spending category, this is for the budget folks. So this is saying what the reason, these are the NIH priorities that this grant checks the boxes of. And it also gives a whole bunch of key terms that are lifted from her grant that are used in all of these various subject matching things. There's also details. There's information about similar projects again. And there's a lot of, if you just click through all these tabs, you will get an awful lot of information here. Now, the next thing that you're going to need to do once you've figured out what institute's going to fund your grant is what type of grant you should apply for. And there's a comprehensive list of all NIH funding mechanisms that are available at this website here. And I'll just go through kind of the classes of grants. One thing that you have to understand is that there are many, many award types, but that not every NIH institute funds all award types. So once you find your subject matter with an institute, then what you're applying for is going to be hemmed in by the type of grant that institute gives. So sort of what people call the bread and butter grants, these are the grants that most of us as individual investigators will be applying for. These are called R grants or research grants. Now, the big one that is often wrapped up in people's productivity is the R01 grant. That is the large investigator grant. They're usually 3 to 5 years. They're usually direct costs in the $150,000 to $500,000 a year range. Those are the kind of the main big grants. There's also the R21 grant, which is the typical grant that is related to what they call high risk, high reward research. The R03, which is the small projects grant. I didn't list it here because I don't think there's anybody on the call that is eligible for it, but R15 grants are also very pertinent. And if there's any Delaware State investigators, that the R15 grant is definitely something that you want to pursue. R15 grants for institutions that receive a certain threshold of awards. Also, if you work in certain health-related colleges and larger institutions, if that's a educational-related health college that doesn't get a lot of research grants, you'd also be R15 eligible. Now, the reason that it's really important to understand what your institute will fund is that, for instance, an R03 grant, R03s are small research project grants, that some institutes will fund R03s in pretty much all fields. in my institute, in the National Eye Institute, they do not fund standard small research projects. The only exception is that they will fund data mining grants. So if you use a large data set, you can get an R03 to mine data out of it, but you cannot get the R03 to do a lab-based experimental project. Another grant that you might find of interest is the R34, which is the clinical trial planning grant. Now, the thing about these R grants is that they're funded by something called the Center for Scientific Review. They are typically not reviewed by institutes, but I'll get to that in a minute. Okay. Then there's also K grants. And for the postdoc who's on the line, that it also can be a K grant might be the kind of thing that they would be looking for. It sort of depends. K grants also may be appropriate for some of you on the call who are new investigators. And these are mentored training to independence awards. So the idea of these Ks is that you have an independent position or you're on your way to an independent position, and that you either have independent funding to start with under a mentoring situation, or there's a transition where you're going for, you start out mentored and you're going to new investigators. So that KO1s and KO2s are very common for clinical investigators, so are KO8s. There's also for people who are in postdoctoral positions, there's the K22. But the K22 is really for people who are doing their postdoc at the NIH. That you might find the K99 to ROO mechanism more appropriate. So if you're a senior postdoc, let's say you're like 3 years into your postdoc, the K99 ROO mechanism allows you to write a hybrid grant. So you will get 2 years of funding to be a senior postdoc and to look for an independent faculty position. Once you get an independent faculty position, that then transitions into an ROO, which is essentially you will have, I think it's 3 years of independent grant funding once you have your actual professor position. And again, not all institutes fund all of these mechanisms. And you really have to read about the details about which of these mechanisms is most appropriate for you. But I actually completely wasn't thinking about the K grants when the question came up about postdoc funding. So if you're a postdoc that's like finished 1 year or so of postdoc training, the F32 is appropriate. That you could only be a postdoc, I think, for under a total of 3 years to be F32 eligible. If you're a more senior postdoc, then you're going to be going for one of these K awards. And I hope that answers the question. And if it doesn't, please chat with Erin and she'll launch in. Okay, again, not all institutes fund all grant mechanisms. So you have to make sure that you found not just the appropriate institute, but the appropriate mechanism that institute funds. All right, so institutes, though, are still huge. So once you have the institute identified, then you have to identify the portfolio or program that funds it. And that's how institutes work is that each institute has broken its funding mission into different programs, and that each program is funded by a program official. And this is the person who really administers, who is involved in really making the final decisions about what's funded. They're also the person who decides that I have a limit. This is the person who maps the grants submitted and the reviews onto the money and makes the real recommendations about whether an individual grant is going to be funded. And before you write your grant, you ideally want to identify who that program official is and be in communication with them, because, and this is really, really crucial. Even if you're applying to a standard mechanism, you can perhaps get away with not identifying that program official, but it's crucial if you're responding to a request for application. These are directed research funds that are set-asides that are directed to fund a specific research type. For instance, let's say the NIH decides that we really need new funding in behavioral analysis of traffic safety. But they're not getting any applications addressing that gap in knowledge. So they will write a request for applications that says, we will fund R01 grants and R15 grants and R03 grants that address research projects related to how to do behavioral interventions for traffic safety. And they will put that RFA out there. The problem with the RFAs, though, is that they're often kind of poorly worded and they poorly articulate the scope. As an example, a few years ago, there was an RFA looking for people who were interested in using very large animals, let's say farm animals, to study questions in developmental biology. And that there were a number of us at the University of Delaware who thought we could go in for that grant mechanism to interface some farm animal research being done by research in developmental biologists that is basic science. And we had a grant planned out. We had specific aims planned out. We then contacted the program officer involved in this program. And it turned out that they were only going to fund infertility research. So they were interested in that interface, but that's not what the RFA said. The RFA seemed much more broad than that. So we would have wasted our time writing this grant if we had just read the RFA. So definitely you need to identify this program officer. And you need to, because it also will determine whether or not the grant actually really fits into the program officer's scope. Just because you think it fits into their scope, if they disagree, even if you get a good score, it means that they're probably not going to fund it because it's not within the scope of their interest. So this is absolutely critical for new investigators, is to identify the program officer. You send them some preliminary aims pages, and you make sure that that program officer is actually interested, because that if you write a great grant, you get a great score, you want to be funded. And if it doesn't fit their focus, they're not going to fund you even if it got a great score. And this is something that you really should do at least 2 months out from the grant deadline, even earlier, and getting into communication. So how do you figure these things out? Well, you can also get an awful lot of information back to the NIH reporter. So going back to the project information, I showed you the description tab. This is the information that the details tab gives you. So again, it gives you the name of the investigator, the title of the grant. But what's very important here, it says program official information. So grants in this area, the program official is Huma Maraj. And this is the program official actually that deals with all 5 of the grants in this area. So this means that if you're interested in studying posterior capsular opacification, the person who's going to make the final funding, or the second to the last final funding decision, is Huma Maraj. And it would be very, very important to write your aims page, get into very early contact with Huma Maraj. And 1, he'll then know that you're applying. 2, he'll know that kind of expect it. You'll get some feedback from him saying whether your research is really within the scope of the interests of his funding priorities. Now, the other piece of information here that is really important. And I think, yeah, okay. So you want to, let's just talk about the program officer right now. So how do you communicate with this program officer? The thing you almost never want to do is cold call him. So that it is publicly available on the NIH site, his phone number. But when you communicate with a program official, pretty much you never want to cold call them. That what you want to do is to send an email requesting an appointment to discuss a potential grant application. That ideally, that email should include information about yourself in your career stage. Preferably, if you could attach your bio sketch to that email, that would be very, very helpful to them. And then also information about the grant you are considering. And ideally, that'll be a well-reasoned, developed specific aims page. This way, the program official will know who you are and will also have a really clear abstract of what your research is. This is not the project summary. This really should be an aims page because the project summaries are usually not very informative. You want to offer some potential times for a phone call, but generally you want to try to be available at this program officer's convenience. The reason you want to have this together is that if you cold call a program officer who doesn't know what your research is and who doesn't know who you are, they really can't give you a lot of useful information. Now you want to have this phone call by a phone call, or you want to try to meet them at a conference or workshop that the NIH staff in your area attend and ask for a one-to-one appointment in that venue. Most of the NIH program officers are sent out to at least one scientific meeting a year, sometimes two, and they usually are going to the large meeting in the area. For instance, all of the NIH program officers for the National Eye Institute go to the Association for Research of Vision and Ophthalmology meeting. They have, the NEI has a booth on the trade show floor. They also are willing to set up one-to-one appointments to talk about grants and funding and their recommendations of what you should be applying to and how you should be trying to sell your research for that funding. And it can be very potent to have that one-to-one meeting. Another possibility is that you can ask for a face-to-face appointment on the NIH campus. I realize the MEUSC folks, this is kind of a long haul, but those of us who are working in Delaware, that it's really only an hour and a half to 2 hour drive down there. It can be worth it to just ask to see if you can get a face-to-face meeting. That generally it's best to have either a phone or a email conversation because there's a lot of things that program officers will tell you verbally that they will not put in writing because anything they write in an email is sort of an official communication that is that sort of says, oh, if they wrote, if you do this, you will get funded. This is almost like a written contract from the NIH. So they are trained to not put much of their advice in writing. And the reason is that year to year, even month to month, the funding climate can change drastically. I mean, as for instance, the National Institutes of Health still does not have a federal budget for the 2017-2018 fiscal year. So that until that bill is signed, there's still going to be differences in grants policy over the next 5 months that's left in that fiscal year, let alone what would be happening during the 18-19 fiscal year. So there's a lot of things they'll tell you on the phone that they won't tell you in writing. Just as an example, I just got an NEI grant, but I have no written proof of that. My program officer basically called me and said that your grant is on the funding list, but he couldn't put that in writing. He could call me and tell me that for written justification or written proof of that, I have to wait until the NIH bureaucracy vomits out a funding letter. My program officer could not send me in an email, oh, by the way, you're going to get funded. Because until that funding letter is generated, there's still things that could happen that could mean that they won't pay the grant. Unlikely, but possible. So you definitely want to have this direct conversation with them. They also might be able to clue you into some political things going on at the Institute, some things related to various priorities that they will never put in writing, but they'll tell you verbally. Okay. Now, the things that you can expect of the conversation, it highly depends on the program officer. Some are very, very serious people and interested in building their grant portfolios. They basically consider themselves curators of a scientific field. So they're not just bureaucrats that are pushing paper from one side to another. They're actually thinking about what's for the best of a field, and they're deciding, sort of making sure they can keep a number of investigators going. People with that mindset are very, very interested in mentoring new investigators. However, there are also program officers that depends on the individual. Some just say, all right, my job is that I have these grants with these scores, I have this money, I map the two on top of each other, my job's done. They're not interested in mentoring, they're not interested in building the field. In the 20 years that I have been funded by the NIH, I've had two separate program officers. My most recent program officer is absolutely in the mentoring category. He's absolutely interested in curating the field and making sure the field stays robust. However, my previous program officer was not interested in that at all. If you asked her questions, she would basically not give you any real advice. And so I can't tell you what that conversation is going to be like. It'll depend on who the program officer is. However, a very high proportion of them are very, very serious and interested in mentoring young investigators because they know that they need young investigators in so that the field stays robust long term. Now, in that discussion, they could tell you that, oh, that area fits their program and grant mechanism, and that it feels a real need, and that we really need young investigators in this area, and they will strongly encourage you to apply. They maybe even give you some advice on how to best take your grant idea and to explain it in such a way to really fit that priority. They could also say that you are completely off base, you've misunderstood the funding priorities of that program or that institute, and that hopefully they will be able to identify what is the correct program and institute where you should be seeking money. Or they could just say that your AIMS page has some significant problems. Maybe a big problem can be people are so introverted in like their techniques, they're not putting into the context about who would care. So they could advise you that you need to completely rework the planned research or really, really go back and think about why the larger field cares about the answer to the question you're asking. All of these things, though, are really, really important to know. And this might not be the conversation you want to have, but otherwise, if you don't have this conversation, you could be really, really wasting your time. Also, this is a case that I can't emphasize enough. It is also your opportunity to impress the program officer. Program officers have a lot of discretion about what to fund or not fund. If they see you as a very, very bright, enthusiastic, engaged person with really, really innovative ideas, and your grant is written, it's scored, but numerically it might be a little bit out of what they would normally fund, the program officer has the ability to take that grant and move it into the fundable range or to fund it. And particularly for new investigators, they have quite a lot of leeway to fund things. But if they have never met you, if they have never talked to you, and you're out of that range, they might not feel as comfortable pulling your grant into their funded portfolio. So, yeah.
We had one question come through chat. It says, I've heard that after the RFA comes out, the information that the PO can give is limited. Is this true even with phone calls or in-person appointments?
Well, it kind of depends on what you say about the information the PO can give. In my experience, the POs are very happy to talk about their RFAs. And it might depend on both the PO as well as the politics of the RFA. There are definitely RFAs that are written because they have already kind of a preconceived notion of who they're going to fund. But very often the whole point of the RFA is that they're trying to bring people into a particular area that are open call for proposals, which is the standard RFA for an RO. There's a standard R01 RFA. That is the standard investigator-initiated project where I got an idea and I'm going to say, I think this is something important, please fund me. That is like the blanket mechanism RFA. Then there are the RFAs where the Institute has really found a gap in what's being done, and they are really interested in bringing new people in. In my experience, those folks are willing to talk to you. I would say is that there is absolutely no downside of contacting a program officer. I mean, it is really, really important that you're never rude to a program officer, that you're always highly respectful, you always show you're clearly listening to what they're saying. Program officers have a really sucky job, actually, because the fun phone call is when they make the phone call and said, oh, you're on the pay line. And, that's the fun part of their day. But they also talk to the people who are on the bubble. I'm not sure I have money because the NIH budget hasn't been passed yet. Or they're talking to the person who lab may be shutting because they haven't gotten their grant. And the program officer doesn't have any money. They can't do anything to move that grant into the funded category. And there it's a case that the program officers most of the time don't want to tell somebody, I'm sorry, I really can't fund your grant, even though you're going to let everybody off and your lab is shutting. So it's just really, really important to be very respectful and not be abusive to that person. But to say that I have a research idea I want to run by you underneath an RFA, that almost all program officers will have that conversation. If there's certain things they can't say, they'll know what that is and they won't say them. That you might ask a question and they might say, I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to talk about that. You just have to respect those things. But that sometimes people are unwilling to ask questions because they heard a rumor that the program officer won't say something. Well, I would say, definitely, have a very respectful conversation, and the program officer will just say, I'm sorry, I just can't talk about that. I hope that answers that.
Melinda, this is Andrew Matuskowitz. I have a question, if you don't mind. Actually, it's two questions. Sorry.
No problem.
The first is, one of the things I'm learning, I wonder what Evan's experience is about this too. Trying to get meetings set up with mentors and other people who can kind of assist you with your methodologies and things often takes a lot longer than I would have thought. So do you find, is it reasonable to, when you're on the timeline, is it reasonable to reach out to several different POs from different, what do you call them? From different institutions within, from different institutes within the NIH, and say, if you have several options that look like they might be potential funding streams, you reach out to several of them and get their thoughts of it so that you can kind of do things in parallel to help optimize your chance of success.
That I think you could definitely plan on doing that. In general, some of it is that I have an amazing PO, but just even talking to colleagues who are working with other POs, I don't know of anybody who actually has problems getting POs to respond to them at the NIH. Just like there's a new investigator in my department who she got the score. She submitted I think it was an R03, and she got the score back that looked like it was fundable. And she was so she waited a few days like you should. And then she in her case, actually, she sent the PO an email saying, do you have time to talk about that? Should I be planning on resubmitting this grant or whatever? And he actually emailed her back and he said, well, you're well within the historical pay line. But of course, I can't give you any guarantees. It's going to depend on how all the budgets hash out in the next 6 weeks with the NIH budget. I mean, and that was something he actually put that in writing that she was well within the pay line. That, generally I've never had trouble getting a phone call with a PO within a week's time frame. But if you are, if you really are completely unsure, like let's say we're doing retinoblastoma, it's perfectly fine to make an appointment with a cancer PO and an eye PO or diabetic retinopathy, to just kind of get a judge of which direction that would be. That certainly doesn't hurt anything.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you. That's really helpful.
Okay.
The second question is really specifically about the Ames page, and this may not be the right venue for it, but as you were talking, I was kind of looking up Ames page skeleton and how it's supposed to look.
Mm-hmm.
Is it just a page?
Right.
And is it always meant to be under a page?
Yeah. Okay. So that in another one of the classes, I'm going to talk about really structuring Ames pages and different ways to do it. But
okay, cool.
The Ames page, but just since the question's being asked here, the Ames page is you should consider that the real abstract of your grant. That for an NIH grant, the summary is really not what anybody reads when they are looking at an NIH grant that's involved in the decision-making process. That summary is just what's out there for public consumption. An Ames page is only one page. It's one page, single-spaced, 11-point Arial, Palantino linotype, or other font that gives you a certain number of characters per line, a certain number of lines per page with half-inch margins. That's the length of an Ames page. The Ames page really should stand alone. You should be able to read the Ames page and know exactly what the grant's about and know exactly why we care. And that during the review process, that it might be the only piece of your grant that is read by most of the people scoring your application. And that's something I'll get into the details about why that is in a later lecture, but it really is the full standalone document. So this is why Ames pages are so valuable and why it's actually not unusual for people to spend 30 or 40% of your grant writing time fine-tuning and refining the Ames page, because it sets up the scope of the work and it sets up the justification for the work. And it's what the program official is going to be reading mostly. It's definitely what the scientific review administrator is going to be reading. And it's going to be probably 80% of the people who are scoring your grant. That's all they're going to read.
Got it. Thank you so much.
And so I can't emphasize enough the importance of an Ames page if you're submitting to NIH. And to be honest, it's pretty important for most grants mechanisms. The length may be different, but most grants mechanisms require an Ames page. And, like I said, and I think it might be the next class, I'll get into exactly how those are structured. Okay? All right.
Thank you.
So, all right. So you've talked to your PO. Now, so that's where you're basically looking on the back end of the grants process when you're talking to the institute and the PO. When you submit your grant, it is assigned to an institute as a potential funder. However, it will take months from the day you submit your grant until the institute really even has anything to do with your grant. And the reason is that the vast majority of grants submitted to the NIH are not reviewed for scientific merit through an institute. They are instead handled by an organization called the Center for Scientific Review. It's also called CSR. There are some exceptions. For instance, K99 ROOs, at least to the National Eye Institute, are reviewed by the National Eye Institute. However, all R grants, all F grants are reviewed by the Center for Scientific Review. So what is that? This is the entry point of when a grant enters the NIH system. It is the organization that handles the actual submission process, they handle 70% of the peer review of all NIH grant mechanisms. And CSR is the one who basically makes the match of the grant topic and the institute initially, and then that is sent to the institute for confirmation later. Okay, so that for dealing with CSR and thinking about CSR, you have to understand how the review process works. So the grant enters NIH, and using a combination of computer tools as well as humans, your grant is assigned to what's called the Integrated Review Group. The Integrated Review Group is a large category of grants of a similar type. I don't know what all of them are. My grants go to the Integrated Neuroscience Review Group. So this is everything having to do with sensing your environment. All the neurological grants, all the hearing grants, all of the eye grants, they all go to this Integrated Neuroscience Review Group. Now, the diversity of the grants coming into that Integrated Review Group is huge. And so once it gets to Integrated Review Group, then it is assigned to something called a study section for peer review. Now, study sections are basically the group of people who have expertise in the area of your application. Now, there are two flavors of study section. There are what are called standing study sections. These are that they know that at any one time there's a large number of applications that fit within this expertise that are coming in. There are also a smaller number of grants that are reviewed by what are called special study sections. This could either be that the research is kind of its own niche, that it requires a special set of expertise, or it could just mean that there are so many conflicts of interest on the study section that would normally review your grant, it has to go to a separate independent panel. So for instance, for people who are members of study sections, their grants cannot be reviewed by that study section because of conflict of interest. So they put together a special panel. Sometimes very in-depth collaborations with the study section member can also cause that to happen. So let's say your research is very collaborative with a member of a standing study section. Your research will not be reviewed by that study section because of conflict of interest things, and they'll put it out as a special. So for right now, I'm just going to talk about standing study sections, but just realize that there are definitely grants that don't just go to a standing study section. Now, it is really critical to try to figure out which study section your grant is likely to be reviewed from, because it informs the information you have to include in your grant. And this is something that when you're grant writing, you always have to write to an audience, and that you have to know what that audience is, because you will, and if you have an idea of what their prejudices are, what their preferences are, what their interests are, then you'll know the hooks you need to write into your research in order to appeal maximally to the study section member. Okay, so we're going back to NIH Reporter again as our friend, that if you, again, have discovered grants that are in similar areas to what you're working in, you can also figure out what study section reviewed that grant. So to go back to, this is actually an NIH Reporter output from one of my awards. If you go down here to here again, my program official is Humana Raj. That this is my title. Down here is the important information of study section. So all of my grants are reviewed by a panel called Biology of the Visual System. Now that might seem obvious, but there's actually 3 vision-related study sections. And one is diseases of the visual system. Now, even though posterior capsular opacification is a disease of the visual system, my grants are never reviewed by that study section. They're reviewed by biology of the visual system. And that's simply because the title doesn't tell the whole story. Diseases of the visual system is largely around certain diseases of the cornea and retina. Biology of the visual system, though, is in charge of infectious diseases of the cornea, as well as all diseases of the lens are seen by this study section. So this is, again, a case where just because it sounds like your grant should go a certain place doesn't mean it will be reviewed there. And you need to, and I could tell you the whole history of why my grant goes here and not a diseases study section, but just it's not possible if you're new to a field to know the history of why certain grants are reviewed by certain study sections. So you're probably, so like in my case, my stuff goes to biology of the visual system. Now, when you click on that link to biology of the visual system, it takes you to this information page. So this is the study section. It gives you the committee name. It gives you the name of the scientific review officer in charge, as well as a link to their email, so that you can communicate with that SRO, and you could ask them that this is what your grant is, that does that SRO think your research fits under the scope of this study section? And this is a case also having that Ames page. You could email the SRO your Ames page and just say, I think this is the study section my work would be reviewed under. Here's my Ames page. Do you concur, or do you think that this work would go to a different study section? And the SROs are usually pretty good about being willing to tell you whether in their opinion, your work is in the scope of their study section or not. That's really the only question you would ask them, but that can be a very, very important question, because by identifying the correct study section, you can then click on this link for view of who is a member of the study section, as well as who was on the roster of the last meeting. Now, when you click on the study section roster, standing study sections all have what are called permanent rosters. To be on a permanent study section roster, you are an expert in the field, and you have almost always received significant prior National Institutes of Health funding in the past in this area. They've served on grant review panels in the past on an ad hoc basis, so they have showed that they actually are willing to take peer review seriously, and they're able to produce high quality reviews. To get onto a study section as a permanent roster, they are either nominated by current study section members or the scientific review officer. After they're nominated, they then must receive endorsement by recognized leaders in the field. That I used to serve as a standing study section member, but I've been off for several years. That when somebody, it's not unusual that when they want to put a new permanent member on, the scientific review officer will shoot me an email or call me up and say, I want to put so-and-so on that study section. Do you believe that this person is actually a leader in the field and appropriate to be on the study section? so that they want to make sure that well-respected people are on the study section. Now, this is a place where it's not unusual for certain scientific areas to have the researchers in that area concentrate in only a few institutions. It's important to note that only one permanent member is allowed on a study section per institution. So to just give you an example, in my field, there is a huge concentration of researchers in my field at Washington University of St. Louis, that they are only allowed to put one scientist from Washington University of St. Louis on the study section. This is to basically prevent people at a certain institution from ganging up and causing conflicts of interest. And it's definitely worth looking at this site, which is talking about how reviewers are selected. Now, the terms of service on a study section, they range from 4 to 6 years. So when somebody's put on permanent on a study section, they could
Bless you.
Oh, God. So when somebody is put on permanent at a study section, they can either decide to serve 4 years serving all 3 study section meetings. So they are committing to 3 2-day-long study section meetings per year and all of the outside work necessary to do grant review. Or they can commit to being on a study section for 6 years, where they only do 2 of the 3 meetings per year. Now, so this means is that there's a lot of continuity on study section, on who is on study sections. So when you click on the roster, you will get a list of who is on a study section in a particular time. So there's the chairperson of the study section, and then all of the permanent members. So this gives you the name and the institutional affiliation of all the study section members. This is really, really important because then you can go through and do research and PubMed searches on every single study section member. You will know what they're publishing on and what their expertise is. And that can be very, very helpful because then you'll know what the research interests of these people are and maybe what parts, and you need to think about what parts of your research might appeal to certain members of the study section. And this is really important for people who you think their research interests overlap yours a lot, is to understand, kind of what they're thinking and what they are thinking is important in the field. To relate your work to the bigger field is key for getting a good grant score. The other important piece of information is this number right here, right at the end of every person's name. So for instance, Michael Bolton, he was chair of the study section until the June of 2017 meeting. That was his last meeting, and he is currently no longer on that study section. However, Michael Anderson, he's a permanent member until 2020. So he may or may not be present when your grant is reviewed because he might only be serving 2 out of 3 meetings. But you know that there's a very high likelihood this person will be sitting on the panel and so forth and so on as you go down. So you want to use that permanent roster info. You want to target the information and justifications in your grant towards the reviewer expertise and interest. You want to ensure that you reference pertinent papers related to the grant written by your study section members. Now, you have to be careful with this. Yes, if there are study section members who are doing important work in your area, you want to reference their work. Now, if you do that, you want to make really sure you get the science correct. And you also want to make sure you're not doing gratuitous referencing. Don't just reference someone's work because they're a study section member. I know when I was permanent on the study section, I would sometimes have people reference my work and get the findings from my science wrong. Let's just say that didn't go over real well, and it kind of reduces people's overall confidence in you. Also, gratuitous referencing is really, really obvious. That basically, it's really obvious when somebody's referencing you because you're a study section member, when the work doesn't really fit. No, we don't actually appreciate getting sucked up to like that. It's way better to not reference a study section member than to gratuitously reference them to stroke somebody's ego. Now, the other thing you use that permanent roster info for is to identify any potential reviewers who you think are biased against you to request they be excluded from the review of your grant. So if you honestly think that somebody is unethical, somebody has done things to show they are actively actively antagonistic to your research, you can consider excluding them. However, you have to use this sparingly. This is a really quick way to irritate the SRO, that just because somebody is a competitor in your research area is not sufficient reason to exclude them. That you have to really think that they have a real bone to pick with you. I've been submitting grants to NIH now for over 20 years, and I have written an exclusion for a grand total of one person. And this was related to an incredibly unpleasant interaction I had with somebody at a conference where I had true justified reason to believe that their review would be biased. That otherwise you have to understand that you will be reviewed by people who are directly in your field and maybe in competition with you. In many ways, they are the best reviewers because they're the real field-specific experts. They're also the people who you may be surprised to learn may be your biggest advocates, especially if you've come up with a really, really interesting idea that they really want to see have done. Somebody like that is likely to be the person who will really go to bat for your grant because they're convinced that your work is so important that it has to get done. So just because that they're a potential competitor doesn't actually mean that that's a downside. It often is an upside. Now, something that the NIH actually did a study, and they said that the biggest predictor about, and the study actually in the end showed the biggest predictor that somebody's going to give a grant a great score is that they are a direct subject matter expert in the field. It is a lot harder to convince somebody out of your field that your grant is in the top 5 or 10 or 15% of all grants submitted than it is to convince somebody who is in your field. Somebody who's in your field is already convinced of the significance and importance of the work. If you are reviewed from somebody out of your field, you have to convince them, which can be a harder sell. So this is actually a good thing, but keep in mind that there is bias and there is an opportunity to request exclusion of certain reviewers. Now, the thing to understand, though, is that it's not just permanent study section members who could be reviewing your grants. It's also ad hoc members. And these are people who are not on the permanent roster. Now, ad hoc members are there for 3 different reasons. One is that they can be brought in to fill a hole in the expertise of the standing study section. For instance, let's say you are doing a big data project related to kidney disease. And so you're proposing to do big data mining and then take that information and do certain work with it. That your grant might go to the disease-specific study section, but there's nobody on the permanent roster who's an expert in big data mining. So they will bring in somebody who is a data analysis expert. Or you're doing something that requires high-level statistical analysis, they'll bring in a statistician. So that person is there to basically really, really assess your methodology or to fill in another expertise hole. Could go the other way. It could be your grants going to a big data study section where everybody's really good with the data mining side, but they are not an expert in, let's say, chronic kidney disease. So they'll bring in a chronic kidney disease expert to assess the importance of the work to the field. Another source of ad hoc members are folks that are being nominated to be permanent study section members or who are being tried out to see whether a nomination is important. It's very important to the SROs that they have good, thoughtful people on the study section. Just because somebody's a good scientist does not mean they're going to be a good study section member. So they want to say, are people doing the reviews on time? Are they writing complete, thoughtful reviews? Are they basically using reasoned arguments, or are they doing ad hominem attacks? That people have to basically show they can do a good job before they get permanent study section status. Another group of reviewers, which is very important for you guys, are early career reviewer participants. Now, it can be very, very valuable to your career to review grants, but new investigators are not eligible to become permanent study section members. They want those to be people who are known leaders in the field. However, one looks really, really good on promotion CVs to show that you have been asked to review. Also, it can be completely transformative to how you look at the grants process to sit in a real study section meeting and participate. So NIH has this thing called the Early Career Reviewer Program. I would encourage everyone on this call to go to this site and to put your name in as a potential early career reviewer. And they are basically newly independent investigators who have not held NIH R01 funding to get them to serve on study sections for a round or two. Usually they're only assigned a small number of grants, so you might only be writing the reviews for 2 or 3 grants, but you are brought in and you sit in the room for a full study section meeting. So you will have the opportunity to really see how the whole process works. And I will tell you that my faith in NIH peer review went up dramatically after sitting in as an early career reviewer, because you could see how much the people on the study section deeply care. You could see how the process works and how really fair it is. And it also makes you stop thinking of blaming the study section for everything or talking about they are doing this or they are doing that to me. You understand that actually they want you to be successful, the study section members, but you also have to write an application that a study section member can advocate for, because there are 100 grants at that study section. Maybe only 10 to 20 of them are going to get funded, and you have to understand that you have to provide the information the study section needs to advocate for your grant for funding. Now, so you have an idea of how the study section handles your grant, is that most standing study sections usually run, a meeting will run between 20 and 30 reviewers are going to be at the study section meeting. So that's the pool of reviewers. The scientific review officer assigns all grants incoming to 3 reviewers. And these reviewers are assigned the roles of primary reviewer, secondary reviewer, and tertiary reviewer. The primary and secondary reviewers have to write a full NIH grant review. The tertiary reviewer can write a 1-paragraph summary of the grant. That when a grant is assigned to the 3 reviewers, the identity of those 3 reviewers are blinded to each other. And it is actually all 3 reviewers are certifying that they're not going to discuss the grant with anybody. And because the goal here is that these 3 reviewers independently, without any discussion from others, score the grant and write independent critiques. So these are meant to be the reviewers' independent assessments. And these are uploaded into a central system. Now, these independent evaluations are due to the NIH somewhere between 3 days and 1 week prior to the meeting. All scores are tabulated, and a
grant that a reviewer thinks is absolutely fabulous is given a 1. A grant that is basically considered a complete waste of time is considered a 9, and the goal is to spread those scores between 1 and 9. The 3 reviewers all do these scores independently, and then they are averaged, and a preliminary grant score is assigned. Now, the reviewers that basically these numbers are used to rank order the grants from the highest scored grant in the initial review group to the lowest initially scored grant in that review group. That at the same time that's being done is that once a grant has been reviewed and the grants are shut down, that in the 3 days prior to the meeting, all the grants and all of the reviews of all the grants are made available to everybody who's sitting on that study section. So absolutely the reviewers are expected to look at the grant reviews and the scores of the other people assigned the grants they reviewed. And they have the opportunity to look at all of the other grants in that study section. So each individual reviewer usually reviews between 9 and 11 grants. A standard study section reviews between 90 and 120. Now, then there's the idea of discussion. So then there is a face-to-face study section meeting. Now that can be through a online video conferencing system. Usually these are face-to-face meetings. And these grants are basically rank order discussed. So the highest scored grant from the initial scores is discussed first, and so down the line. That after the top half of grants have been discussed, that a motion is made to make the rest of the grants not discussed. This is also what you may have heard of as triaging. Now, of the grants that received the 50% lowest scores in the initial review, that any study section member can say, no, I think this grant who was in the lower half of scores, that I think this grant should be discussed. Now, this is almost always done when there's a wide score discrepancy. For instance, if one person gives the grant a 1 and another gives the grant a 6. Sometimes it's also done if there's a grant that has particularly compelling ideas. Any grant that is initially scored in the bottom half of scores and there's not a study section member willing to advocate for its discussion, that all of the 3 reviews that were initially done are packaged and they're just sent to the person submitting the application. And you will see on your grant critiques these 2 little stars, which basically mean not discussed. So this is a case where it's really important for it to be compelling, because otherwise nobody's going to bother. And the thing you have to understand about that is that even the best funded grant mechanism funds only 30% of applications. The point of this is not to trash people's careers. The point of this is not to diss people. It's basically saying that, one, people's time is important. Why are we going to discuss grants that have no chance of being funded? The other reason is that it really gets to a point where everybody just starts jumping on a grant. It just becomes kind of gratuitous trashing of a grant. I was actually just recently on an NIH study section that did not have triage. And the reason was that we only looked at 8 grants, and they don't do triaging for very small study sections. And there was 2 grants that received preliminary scores of 7. And it was basically simply, we were just essentially all piling on to saying why this grant was so terrible. It wasn't productive. It didn't help the investigator. And there was really no point to it. So
that's the reason that not discussed happens, is that when a grant's not good, it's just really easy to pile on. And it's wasting everybody's time because it's not going to make that grant get funded. Now, so there's a discussion that occurs. Reviewers are asked to revise the initial critiques after the discussion if their opinion or score changes due to the discussion. This actually happens reasonably frequently, especially when there's initial scores can be kind of divergent. Like one person thinks this is the best grant ever, and somebody else thinks it's average, it's a 3 to a 4. And this is a case where the person who thinks it's average is going to make their public comments. The person who thinks it's wonderful is going to make their public comments. And often people are seeing each other's opinions, and scores can basically be pulled better or pulled worse based on that discussion. Now, the discussion is summarized. So the scientific review officer and the study section chair collaborate on writing a summary statement for all of the discussed grants. These go to the applicant as well as the program officer. Now, how is the funding decided? Actually, let me see here. I have this here. Okay. So just one thing I want to say about the study section, though, is that remember I said that 70 or 80% of the people reviewing the grant and scoring your grant will have not read your grant. They will only look at the Ames page. If you notice, the only people who are obligated to write full reviews are the 3 assigned reviewers. However, the actual score and the actual number, that vote is every single study section member present in the room. So that when the review is happening, the primary reviewer gets up and says, this is what this grant is about. These are its strengths. These are its weaknesses. And this is why I gave it a preliminary score of whatever. The secondary reviewer basically says the same thing. Either says I completely concur, or there are these other aspects of the grant that need to be addressed. Then the third reviewer says the same thing. Then there's a discussion in the room from the other 20 or so study section members. Most of them will have only looked at your biosketch and your Ames page. So they look at your biosketch to see if you're competent to do the study. They look at your Ames page to see exactly what the grant is about. They almost never have time or will look at the rest of the grant. If they have questions about why a grant was scored the way it was based on the discussion of the assigned reviewers, they'll ask those questions. Sometimes other reviewers will have read the whole grant because it was an area they were particularly interested in. So there will be questions. Then after that discussion is done, they go back to the original reviewers and they say, did your scores move? Are you going to give the same score you gave initially, or did the discussion sway your score to be a worse score or a better score? And those study section members then give their final scores. So let's say the study section members, their final scores are 1, 2, and 3. Then the announcement will be the scoring range is 1 to 3. So that means that everybody in the room is going to vote. That generally the expectation is they're going to vote either a 1, 2, or 3 on the grant, and what they're going to vote is going to depend on how they viewed the discussion. However, sometimes reviewers in the room will not be convinced by the assigned reviewer's discussion. And then it will be, is anybody voting outside of the range? And they will ask people around the room, are you going to give a worse score or maybe a better score than the assigned study section members will give? They just have to announce that. And if the reasons for that score are outside of something that's already been mentioned, you're supposed to write a little blurb to say why you gave that score outside of the range. So all of that results in a whole bunch of numbers. So we'll have 20 to 30 independent scores of your grant, which are then averaged. So this is the raw scores from the study section are combined. Okay, let me back up a second. So they're averaged and then multiplied by 10. So that if you get your score back and you got a 23 on your grant, that probably means the range was 2 to 3. More people voted 2 than 3, so your average was a 23. If you receive a whole number score, such as a 20, it probably means that all 3 reviewers agreed that your grant was a 2. Everybody in the room, based on the discussion, agreed your grant was a 2. So all 20-some scores were 2. The average was a 2. Your total score was a 20. All right. Now, that number is very, very arbitrary. Different study sections will, there are definitely study sections which are hard graders. Basically, they never give a grant score of a 1. So that, and then there are other study sections where 10% of the grants might get the score of a 1. So since one program officer may be trying to make funding decisions from grants from a hard grading study section versus a not hard grading study section, the raw score is actually not a fair way to decide funding. How funding is decided is based on the percentile score. The percentile score is basically the percentage of grants that scored better than yours. So if you have a percentile of a 10%, or you hear somebody say, I have a 10 percentile, that means your grant scored better than 90% of grants submitted. Now, it's not just based on that study section meeting, though. It is based on the scores that study section has given from the last 3 meetings. So it basically means that of the 300 grants that a study section has seen over a year, your grant was scored in the top 10% of those grants. So this does 2 things. It evens out differences in average scores due to different study section cultures. It also evens out the vagaries of whether or not sometimes a study section will get lots and lots of great grants at a meeting, and the next study section meeting will get lots and lots of drecky grants. So the idea is to average out those sort of different random differences just because of study section meeting. Now, once your grant has been scored and percentiled, that information, along with the grant reviews and the summary of the discussion, then goes back to your institutional program officer. Now, these are coming from many different study sections, and they are then have to look at the budget, the requested funding, the funding priorities of the institution's grant portfolio, and the areas of your grant. So they take this information all together and they basically rank the grants as definitely fund, but at partial budgets or durations, fund if money available, and do not fund. Essentially, if your grant is not scored, it is automatically in the do not fund pool. However, let's say your grant got a 35th percentile. It's likely to be in the do not fund category unless, and this is a big unless your work is in an area that the Institute has identified as a major need of the Institute, that somebody needs to work on this. They might fund a grant out of percentiles. So there are people who will get worse grant scores than other scores who get funded, while somebody with a better score will not, because that grant fit the institutional priorities of the Institute. Another place where this can help people on this call are related to the career stage. Career stage is a major deal. NIH has made a huge commitment to fund early career investigators. So definitely, if you are of an early career stage, that you will get funding priority and that they will fund grants with worse scores than people who have already had NIH grants. Another determination is what other funding the investigator has. This will depend on program officer, and institute. Some institutes just take a look at the grants and they'll draw a line, and that they will have absolutely no compunction of giving an investigator 3, 4, 5 R01s. However, smaller fields basically are much more likely to really take into consideration what funding an investigator very much has. Like in my field, they will fund multiple R01s for investigators. But to get your first R01, you don't need as good a score as you need to fund your second R01. And the reason is that it's a very small field. They really want to make sure they can keep the leaders in the field funded. And they're not going to give one person 3 R01s if there's somebody else who is also a leader in the field who looks like they're going to have none because their grant is on the grant bubble. So as a general rule of thumb in my field is that your second grant has to have a much higher score than your first grant did to get funded. Other fields, that's not true. That it also is the details of the grant reviews. Sometimes the reason a grant didn't score well or really, really highly might have to do with something that the program officer doesn't think is a significant reason. So there's a huge part of the subjective opinion of the program officer here. So this is why as a new investigator particularly, getting to know your program officer is pretty important. Trying to get yourself to conferences where your program officer goes to so that you can sit down and talk to that program officer. It absolutely helps getting your grant funded if the program officer already feels that you are probably up and coming and they really want to see you funded. Now, these program officer, this first line program officer work is not the final say on what's funded. It is hugely influences it, but it is really cast as a recommendation to something called the Scientific Council. Now, a institute scientific council is basically a group of very senior extramural investigators they probably were study section members. They have been funded for many, many years. They are the recognized leaders of the field. And they essentially take a look at the grants that we're seeing. They take a look at the program officer's funding recommendations. And they basically are another level of check on the system. Now, most of the time, the Scientific Council simply agrees with the program officer's assessment. Because a good program officer knows what the priorities are, is making their decisions on funding in an evidence-based way. However, the Scientific Council is set up as a second layer of peer review. So if they choose to, they can look at grants in the category of fund if money available, and they can really say, no, you really have to fund this. This is such important work that, we really need to get this grant funded. They can also say something that's in the definitely fund category. They can look at it again and say, yeah, you're going to fund it, but maybe they requested 5 years. Maybe you're only going to maybe they would recommend you only fund it for 3 for a number of reasons. And they can also use their expertise to point out grants which should or shouldn't be funded. Now, so the Scientific Council does the second layer of peer review. It's mostly there as a check. The Scientific Council is also is the one who deals with appeals. Let's say that somebody's grant was reviewed. They felt that the review was very biased, unfair, inaccurate. The Scientific Council is who deals with those complaints. Just a word of advice. It's almost never worthwhile to appeal your reviews, but if you choose to do so, it's the Scientific Council that adjudicates that. Now, once the PO's list, the program officers list, has been basically either ratified or modified after the scientific council's rulings, then the institute's leadership signs off on final funding. And that's when the award letter occurs. So, for instance, my PO basically called me after my grant had been through the scientific council review, saying that this is on the list to go to final funding, and that this is how many years you got of funding. Now, some of this also, though, there is, after this round has happened, there's another whole layer of compliance that's done. So this is where that, like, they're not, like if you're doing human subjects research, they're not going to fund you unless all your human subjects certifications are in place and your IRBs are approved. If you're doing animal research, this is where they check to make sure your IACUC is approved. If you are getting a renewal of grant funding, this is where they make sure that every single paper you have published is compliant with the rules that all papers are in the public domain a year after their publication, and so forth and so on. So there's this big layer here of checking for compliance. And if you've done everything right and you've given all the information requested, that should be easy. But I definitely have had colleagues that did not get their IACUC approvals done correctly, and their funding got really held up and almost didn't happen because this is where the final regulatory approvals were not done correctly. Okay. Now, this is the whole process. And I've talked about why you contact your program officer before your review, but you also might want to end up contacting them after review. I already mentioned an example that once you get your score, to find out whether it really is in the ballpark for funding or not, I have gotten disappointing news when I've done that, or excited news when I'm doing that. One time I got a grant score that I thought was absolutely not in the ballpark for funding. I call up the program officer, and they said, oh, yeah, it's absolutely well within the funding line. It's also a case where I have gotten a grant score that I thought was great, but it happened during the NIH sequester, and it turned out a historical great score was not going to get funded because of the NIH sequester. Now, this is again a place where never cold call a program officer about a grant score, because they need time to look up your grant score, read your grant reviews, and to figure out what they're going to say to you. If you cold call them, and especially if you are cold calling them and you're pushy, they can't tell you anything. So, but if you make an appointment to talk to them on the phone, they will be prepared to tell you verbally what's going on. Almost never will they put it in writing. My colleague's situation was very, very unusual, that a grants officer was willing to even say that much in writing. Most of the time they will say nothing. All right, this is also a case that once you have your reviews, to see if the program officer has any insight on how to revise the application when resubmitting, or they can also give you some insight whether you should bother to even resubmit, or you should just completely rework the application from the beginning. This can be very helpful if your grant was discussed, but it didn't score very well, because the program officers usually are listening to the review of the grants on a conference call. So while sometimes they're in the room, but often they're on the conference call, so they can listen to the discussion and they can figure out whether or not that's you can get some more insight from them. This is also a place where you can let drop your professional situation. And this can help you sometimes if your grant's on the border. There is a sympathy factor for new investigators. This can be really important if you're on the bubble or if there's funded money. That kind of new information can be important. it can also affect the timing. We had an investigator here who had gotten a fundable score on their R01 while they were in the process of doing their tenure application. And she talked to her program officer because it would be very, very valuable for her to have a funding letter from NIH before her tenure application goes through all the steps in tenure. And instead of her grant was supposed to be funded in December 1, but because of the situation of her tenure application, the program officer took end of year money and funded the grant starting October 1, so that she got the award letter in time to have that included in her tenure packet. Where if it had been funded December 1, that she wouldn't have had that information in time to have it considered in her tenure packet. So that's a case where it moved her funding start earlier because the program officer wanted to see her get tenure, so wanted to be able to get that award letter to her. Another case where I've seen this really help if your grant is in the on the bubble fund if there's money category is that let's say you publish a very good paper with the preliminary data in the grant between the time it was submitted and the time that it's up for funding. I actually personally had a case where I'm sure that this helped. I had a grant that was on the funding line. I had published a very high profile paper on this subject around the time the grant was going to council. And I was able to talk to the program officer. I then sent them a copy of the paper. And that grant that was on the bubble got moved very quickly into the funded category. So this is a case where late new information can really, really helpful. A couple other things, if your grant is borderline about whether it's going to be funded or not, is that contact them at the end of the fiscal year, which is usually in the September range. That's where they often will figure out whether there's leftover money. And they can fund grants that they didn't fund for a December pay line or for a March pay line, but they have some money left in September. Well, they can go back and fund those grants if they want to. So, to just kind of say, hey, my grant was on the line. Is there any end of year money? Another place that for everybody on this call, it's really important is that you can point out that your grant, when you talk to them, is eligible for dual funding with NIGMS via the IDEA program. So NIGMS does have some money set aside to fund grants, fund meritorious grants submitted by investigators at an IDEA stage. And that NIGMS will either solely fund the grant or will say to the Institute, I'll tell you what, we'll fund half of it if you fund half of it. And because this is somebody we want to see funded because they're working in an IDEA stage. Now, this is definitely not something you can count on. Very few grants, by and large, get funded this way with dual funding through IDEA. But since you are all IDEA investigators, it never hurts to ask. And sometimes the program officers are not aware of the IDEA dual funding possibilities. And if you put it on their radar screen, sometimes they're happy to apply to NIGMS for dual funding. So that with all of that, my take-home message is that you want to understand the review process for your grant. You want to use the information to position your grant for success. And you definitely want to be in contact with your NIH program officers to review the funding mechanisms and the funding plan. Okay? And I'd like to thank everybody for joining. And this actually went a little bit longer than I usually go for this, but I apologize ahead of time. And hopefully you were able to stay on the call.